All right, continuing on with Chapter 10, we talked about pesticides and resistance to pesticides and how pesticides can have to get stronger and stronger because the bugs get stronger and stronger. On the bottom here is some more info about pesticides, not in your book, it's on the AP test. Broad-spectrum pesticides are a type of pesticide that kills a wide variety of insects, including good bugs like bees, which are essential for pollination. And that's where these big, broad-spectrum pesticides are bad, because you're killing not only the bad bugs, but you're killing the good bugs too. And that's not very sustainable. Turning to 284. 284 talks about biocontrol, which is using good bugs to eat bad bugs. And so they told you about the cactus moth in Australia that killed invasive cactus. It also talks about braconid wasps. And braconid wasps are wasps that are not harmful to humans, but they'll go in and they'll kill off bad bugs. And so farmers will release these wasps into their fields and kill bad bugs. And then Bt bacteria is a natural soil bacteria that produces a protein that kills many caterpillars and the larvae of some flies and bees. So farmers will actually spray this bacteria on their crops to prevent caterpillars and flies and beetles. And this is a good use for organic farmers, because organic farmers can't spray synthetic pesticides, which are man-made, but they can spray natural pesticides, and one of them is Bt bacteria. One of the problems right now with genetically modified crops is that the regular farmers, or actually the scientists in the lab, have now put this bacteria inside the genetically modified crop, which means these crops are grown with this Bt bacteria already in it. And it's making the organic farmers mad, because they're like, well, maybe eventually if so many GM crops have this in it, then they might become resistant. And then we will no longer have this in our arsenal to use. And our organic farmers are very limited in what they can use. They have to be organic. And so that's a problem. Organic farmers cannot use genetically modified crops. All right, here are the best pesticides for health and the environment. Bt bacteria is great for health and the environment. Braconid wasps are. Insecticidal soap is great. You can even buy that at Home Depot. It's a great pesticide to spray on your houseplants if you have aphids, because it's not very harmful to human health. And then toxic plant derivatives. Some plants are already toxic, and if you take those and you extract the toxin out of it, you can spray it as a natural pesticide on your crops. All right, here's a solution to broad spraying. Integrated Pest Management on page 285 under Integrated Pest Management combines biocontrol and chemical methods. All right, Integrated Pest Management does a variety of these methods. Biocontrol, habitat alteration, crop rotation, close monitoring of pests, mechanical pest removal, genetically modified crops, alternative tilling like no-till. They do some spraying of pesticides, but this is an alternative to broad spraying, and it prevents the pesticide treadmill that we talked about on the previous page. So this is a solution to broad pesticide spraying. Organic farmers do all of these except GM crops. GM crops farmers are not allowed to use if they want to be labeled organic, and they also cannot use synthetic pesticides. But the rest of these can be used by organic and non-organic farmers. Next page, 286. Some other pollinators that you need to know about are flies, wasps, beetles, hummingbirds, bats, moths. All of these animals can pollinate. Don't just think it's bees. Bees are very, very, very important, but they are not the only pollinators. Bees are in trouble with something called colony collapse disorder. So the European honeybees are the ones that pollinate 90-something% of our crops, and without them, we have no food. So we're not exactly sure what's going on. It could be little mites that are causing the colonies to disappear. It could be environmental stresses. It could be malnutrition. It could be pesticides. They're narrowing it down to, what I heard last was a new species of mite that they couldn't identify before. But it could be a combination of all of these factors. So how do we help with colony collapse disorder? Well, going back first of all real quick, this is not in your book because it's new since the book was published. It's only been in the past 4 or 5 years that we have discovered that our honeybees are in trouble. How do we help? So if you are a homeowner or a renter, and even if you're in a large city, you can encourage populations of pollinating insects by planting gardens of flowering plants that nourish pollinating insects and by providing nesting sites for bees. These can be simple contraptions made out of wood that have holes in plastic straws. So go ahead and read the rest of that to see how you as an individual person can help our pollinators. All right, going on to the genetic modification of food. Okay, so what we do to genetically modify crops is we take out a gene from some other organism, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's another plant, and we insert it into bacteria using plasmids, which are pieces of DNA, not the regular DNA strand, but a plasmid DNA, and then we let them reproduce. So on this page it explains actually genetically modified crops pretty well. So know what these terms mean: genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms, the word recombinant DNA. E. coli is used a lot in this process. Transgenic organisms are organisms with foreign DNA in them. Transgenes are genes with pieces of other DNA from another organism in them, and the word biotechnology. Page 288, here are the famous crops that have been genetically modified. There are 8 of them on this page, but there's only 4 that you need to know about. You need to know about the Flavor Savor tomato, so read through that. BT crops, I talked about that earlier. Starlink corn, and Roundup Ready crops. So read about these 4 for your test. Page 290 talks about what countries use genetically modified crops. The U.S. is number 1 in genetically modified crops. Genetically modified crops are not allowed in Europe, although they're starting to loosen those regulations and are considering allowing them in Europe, because Europe has stricter laws than the United States. The United States is very pro-corporation, and the United States requires a little bit of testing, preliminary testing, to see if something's safe. If they find out it's safe in preliminary testing, they allow it to go on the market. Now this includes genetically modified crops. It also includes house cleaners and other kinds of things. And Europe's different. Countries in Europe have to go through extensive testing before a product of any kind is allowed to be sold to consumers. And so Europe has been waiting to see if there's been anything bad before they allow genetically modified crops in Europe. And so who have they looked at? Who's been the guinea pigs? Who's been the test subjects? That would be you and I, because about 90% of what we eat in the grocery store, in boxes, in the middle aisles, in boxes and bags, is genetically modified. And so really, it hasn't really harmed our health very much. Harmed our health. Nothing terrible has happened to us, and so Europe has looked at that and went, okay, I think we may allow it. So here's some positives and negatives. The negatives are issues. So here are some of the issues with genetically modified foods and some of the positives. Let's talk about the issues. Big business dominates your food supply in genetically modified food because it's big corporations that have developed the genetically modified crops. And this threatens the independence of the small farmer. And that's not great. Another problem is that GM pollen can spread into non-GM fields, which we learned about in the case study with the maize into Mexico. Right now, genetically modified crops are a giant experiment with no controls, and it causes a decrease of food biodiversity. Here are the positives of genetically modified food. Some crops have less pesticides sprayed on them because the crops have pesticides in them. So we might be eating a little bit of pesticide in our food, but it's not being sprayed into the environment. Better nutrition in developing world due to nutrients bred into the rice, and so they've genetically modified rice with certain vitamins and minerals in them and have helped poor kids from malnutrition in developing countries. We've developed drought-resistant plants, which is great with our water supply, and we've developed salinity-resistant plants to prevent or to help plants grow when there's salinization in the soil. Those are good things. All right, page 292 and 293. Know the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. This lays out guidelines for open information about exported crops. So if you grow a crop in, for example, chili. Chile sends us a lot of produce during the winter in California because in Chile, they're in the southern hemisphere and it's their summer. So they send grapes up here. So you can have grapes in the middle of winter. And so those grapes, you have to have open information. What pesticides were used, what fertilizers were used, were they genetically modified crops? And that is all laid out in this protocol, which is a type of treaty. The Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety is a type of treaty that you have to disclose in exported crops what you did to those crops. 294 and 295. Problems with monoculture. On 295, which is actually under preserving crop diversity, is that with monoculture, if you have a disease, a bug or a fungus or a bacteria or something that goes through your crops, it can wipe out an entire crop over several states, and that would be a catastrophe for our food security. Turning to 296, some places are trying to save seeds and preserve them, so if we do have a catastrophe and a total wipeout of a monoculture, we have some seeds with genetic resistance at least being stored at universities or other institutions to preserve these seeds before they're extinct. Going on to feedlots and our animal consumption. All right, so animals, the consumption of animals actually creates kind of a problem in the environment. We love our meat in the U.S., but it creates some issues. You can see down here our consumption of meat has risen dramatically even in the last 50 years. Kind of crazy. So a lot of our animals, cows, end up in feedlots. And a feedlot, also known as a factory farm, all of that poop from thousands of steer from cows pollutes the surface and groundwaters. And it requires a lot of antibiotics because they're so crowded that diseases can spread. So when you eat a steak or a hamburger, you're actually eating antibiotics in them from the cow that had to get shots of antibiotics to prevent disease because they were so crowded together. They think this is one of the reasons why humans are becoming so antibiotic resistant is because we're eating milks and cheeses and beef and chickens that are full of antibiotics because of the way that we're raising our animals to slaughter.